Hey everyone, it's Mary at Calumet Knits, and I have a new tutorial today to show you how to make a neck warmer on your circular knitting machine. So this pattern comes in 3 sizes, a small, medium, and large, and it also can be used on 4 different machines. So let's get started. First, we want to complete a gauge swatch. Now you'll want to use the machine that you're going to make your neck warmer on. What I'm showing you here is just a sample that I have on my 22. So we start off by measuring our row gauge, and that is just the number of rows within 4 inches or 10 centimeters. So I will mark off 4 inches on my sample using some straight pins, and then I will simply count the number of rows between the pins, and that equals my row gauge. So I have my knitted tube here, one of them, and the first thing we want to do is mark the cast on edge. This is going to be helpful for aligning our 2 tubes together for seaming. So what I'm going to do is add a few stitch markers. I'll put one up towards the top and then 2 side by side just a little ways away. This is going to tell me which direction the cast on edge is pointed. Switching over to the bind off edge, here we're going to mark our side seams. This is going to be helpful for when we join our tubes together. And you'll see that there's this little hole right here. This is where we made the change from our main yarn to our waste yarn. So this column, or in between column of stitches, is where we're going to place the marker. This is going to be our side seam, and we'll use this column to seam the 2 panels together. So if I fold my tube right on that edge, you'll notice that my column of stitches, the V is pointing towards the cast on edge. So the V is opening up to the right. So we also need to mark the other side of the tube. And we'll do that by flattening out our tube or counting over half the number of needles that you have on your machine. We'll count over half that number of stitches. So once we have this laid out flat, you can see the column of stitches that points down to the cast on edge. That's the opposite side seam that we'll mark. So I have my tube vertically now, and I'm putting the bind off edge on the bottom, the cast on edge at the top, and I'm going to fold both edges into the middle. When I do this, I want to make sure that the tails are on the top side or the outer side of this flat tube. So you can see here my cast on tail, or my bind off tail is on the bottom side of this circle here. And then also on the top, you'll see that the tails are coming off the top side of the circle. So when we join these together, we're going to start at those 2 tails and work our way all the way around. So be careful not to have any twist in your tube as well. So before we get started on grafting our tubes, I want to show you on these 2 small samples the stitches that we'll be doing. Now if you haven't done grafting before, I would suggest starting off with some sample pieces with waste yarn and following the same instructions, just to have some practice. Now we'll be joining the tube with, I'm using this green yarn here so you can see the stitches. And we're going to go from the bottom to the top all the way across both tubes here. Now I'm going to start with creating what I call a setup stitch. And to do that, I'm going to go up from behind the stitch and pull that through. So all of the directions are going to be from the front side of the fabric. So I'm going up from behind on the top row, just like we did on the bottom, and I'll pull that through. So the stitches that I do on the bottom, I'm also going to do on the top side. Now we're going to start our normal repeat. So I'm going to go down through that previous stitch. So down from the front side of the fabric to the back side, and I'll pull that stitch through. And then I'm going to come up from the back side and pull that stitch through. So when I say down, I'm referring to the front side of the fabric. I'm going to go down through the front side and then up from the back side. So on the top, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to go down through the previous stitch, and then I'll come up through the back of the stitch of the next stitch. Okay, and we're going to alternate between the top and the bottom. And this time we're going to combine the two steps together. So I'm going to go down through the first part, or down through the previous stitch, and I'll come up through the next stitch, all in one movement. And then pull the yarn through. And now we'll do the same on the top. I'm going to go down through the previous stitch, turn my needle, and come up through the back of the next stitch. So we'll continue alternating between the top and the bottom, going down through the previous stitch and up through the next stitch. And you can see I'm adjusting my tension here a little bit. We'd like to try and match the same stitches in the rest of the tube there so it becomes seamless. So I'm going to go down through that previous stitch and up through the next stitch. So you can see I've got 2 stitches already formed, and they are lined up with the rest of the stitches on both tubes. And if I was using the same colored yarn, it would be almost seamless. So what I do on the bottom, I need to do on the top. So we go down through the previous stitch and up through the next stitch. And we just created the right leg of the next column of stitches. Now we'll do the left leg by doing the same movement, going down through the previous stitch, up through the next, and then repeating that on the top side. And there's our left leg. So that is the movements that we are doing when we're grafting, and hopefully this gives you a better visual on what we're doing when we have waste yarn on our tubes. So with that, let's get started on grafting our tubes together for our project. So our first step to grafting is marking the first and last stitch on both sides of the tube. So on the bind off side, our first stitch is to the left of the tail, and our last stitch is the same stitch as the tail. So I'm going to mark those two as stitch markers. And then on the top side, our first stitch will be to the left of the tail, and to the right of the tail is the last stitch. So using our long tail from the bind off edge, we're going to create a setup stitch. Now the setup stitch is going to be one stitch from the bottom side of the tube and one from the top. So we'll start by going up through our first stitch from the inside of the tube towards the outside of the tube, and we'll pull our tail through. Then we'll do the same on the other side. We'll go up through that first stitch and pull the tail through. So now we're ready to do the main stitch that you will do across the entire tube. So we're going to go down through our previous stitch right here and pull that tail through. As we're pulling the yarn through, we're going to try and keep the tension the same going across this entire row, and we're going to try and mimic the stitch length of the stitches we're creating to the stitches that are in the rest of our tube, so that this one grafting row blends nicely. So the second part of the repeat is to come up through the next stitch. So we went down through the previous stitch, and now we're coming up through the next stitch. So we'll do the same on the top. We'll go down through this previous stitch, and then up through the next stitch. So we're just going to alternate going back and forth with these two stitches, and we can actually combine this movement into one, which makes it a lot easier when you're pulling that tail through. So we'll go down through the previous stitch, wrap the needle around, and come up through the next stitch, and then pull that through. And then we'll repeat that on the top, go down through the previous stitch and up through the next stitch. So we'll continue this pattern of going down through the previous stitch, up through the next stitch, alternating between the bottom side and the top side. We'll go all the way around, and I'll meet you back just before the last stitch there, and I'll show you how to finish this up. So I'm on my last set, and I'll show you. This is difficult to see, that's why I always make sure I add the stitch markers. So I'm going to go down through my previous stitch, and I'm going to come up through my last stitch. And we'll do the same on the top. We'll go down through the previous stitch and up through that last stitch that's on the stitch marker. Now that we've gone through that last stitch marker there, we can go ahead and remove our waste yarn. And you'll want to do this carefully, especially around the last row there where we grafted. So once the waste yarn is removed, we should have something that looks like this, where you have your 4 stitch markers and a couple of tails and a bit of a hole. So we're going to work on closing this hole up, and it's slightly different than what we've done. So right now my tail is coming off the top, so I'm going to come down to the bottom and go down through our previous stitch, which is the green stitch marker, and I'll go ahead and remove that. And normally we would come over to the next stitch here, but we're going to go up a row because we're knitting in the round. So I'm going to find the stitch that I created when we first started grafting, and I'm going to go through that. And I'll remove this stitch marker here. Now we're going to do the same on the top side. So we'll go down through the previous stitch, remove the stitch marker, and again, instead of going through the next stitch, we're going to go up a row and grab that stitch. And now we can remove this stitch marker here, and there we have. Our grafting is now complete. Well, almost. We still need to move our tails so that they are in the same spot here. And to do that, I'm going to kind of do a duplicate stitch where I'm going to go over the stitch below it, and I'm going to right through this hole here, and then I'm going to come out the same hole as that tail. And I'm just kind of going over that one leg of the stitch. Now I can knot these 2 tails together and bury them inside the tube. After you have the tails buried, the one last thing I do is just put a stitch marker to indicate where my grafting row is. We'll use this as a place where we're going to align the 2 tubes for seaming. So here I have my 2 tubes. I've got my side marker seams, I've got my grafting row indicators, and I've got my stitch markers for indicating the cast on edge. And I have my cast on edge on the left or on the right side here. So before we start to seam, I just want to, on the top tube there, I kind of just want to move that grafting row indicator to the other side so that it's closer so that I can start seaming. So I'm going to align those markers. Now this doesn't have to be exact, but I kind of wanted them in the same area. And we'll start seaming right at those markers. I've got my side seam column facing up so that I can see those stitches. And those stitches are going to be facing towards the left, which will wrap all the way around, kind of pointing to the cast on edge. So align these 2 grafting rows up the best you can, and we'll start seaming. So I have my two seams lined up. Both column of stitches are pointing to the left, and I'm going to pick up 2 bars just by inserting my needle and picking up 2 bars there. And I'm not exactly finding the grafting rows, but I'm in the general area. And I'll pull that tail almost all the way through. I'm going to leave about a 6 or 8 inch tail. Then I'll go to the other tube and do the same thing. I'll just insert my needle and find 2 bars and pull that tail through. So we'll go back to the other tube and we're going to go down through the previous stitch. And I'll pick up 2 more bars and pull the tail through. Back up to the other side, go down through the previous stitch and pick up 2 bars and pull the tail through. So we'll just keep alternating between sides, picking up 2 bars at a time. When you reach the stitch markers, you can just go ahead and I like to move it to the other side because I'm just starting. So in case I make a mistake or something and I need to unstitch, I still have my correct column identified. Continue to alternate between sides, picking 2 stitches up at a time and pulling the yarn through. When you have about 2 or 3 inches done, you'll want to stop and pull on your tail or your working yarn to remove the slack in the stitches. Now I like to do this every about 3 inches or so. It just ensures that I don't have any knots in my working yarn that'll get caught up, and I won't have to undo too much if there is a knot. So here you can see I've done a little bit, and now I'm just going to pull on my working yarn, and you can see how it just zippers up really nicely, and it looks just like another row of stitches. So we'll continue to move down the same column of stitches on both sides, going down through the previous stitch, picking up 2 bars and pulling the tail through, alternating sides. And then when you get to be about an inch away from your starting point is where I like to stop, and we'll stretch our seam, and I'll show you that here in a second. So you can see I'm almost finished. I do have a small hole here, but I want to show you how to stretch the seam so that it flexes with the rest of the knitting. So I start by holding on to my starting point, and then I'm just pulling down on the fabric, and you'll feel the seam in there move with the fabric. So we want to get it as flexible as possible. So I'm just going to keep going around and around until I don't feel any more tightness in that seam. So when I'm satisfied how it feels, I'll go ahead and finish up these last few stitches. It's a tight space, but if you need to loosen up a couple of stitches, that's fine. So once I reach the beginning of where I started, I'll actually move the tails to the inside of the neck warmer, and I'll knot the tails and bury them there. And then the last thing to do is just remove all of the remaining stitch markers. I hope you enjoyed the video. Below are the links to Etsy and Ravelry for the pattern. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. Don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel for more circular knitting machine tutorials. Thanks for watching.